Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Modern Adoption, the podcast where we explore the frontiers of adoption, striving to modernize every aspect of this complex journey. My name is Jess. I'm a two-time birth mom.
And my name is Erin. I'm a two-time adoptive mom, and we are your hosts. Each episode, we bring you insightful interviews with experts and discussions on the latest advancements in adoption. And we're not just here to talk, we are here to inspire change.
I know we say this every episode, but we are so excited for this episode today. When Erin and I decided that we wanted to start this podcast, we didn't want to be another podcast for just sharing stories. We really wanted to have tough conversations and be a source for education for adopting families and adoption professionals. And then we met our guest for today and knew that we wanted to give her the space to share her story because it is a story that we hope will educate and inspire adopting families this National Adoption Awareness Month. Bethany Ayer is an adoptee and a working mom to 3 little girls who hasn't really shared her story before. So we are incredibly honored that she is sharing it with us. Bethany, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I was so happy to meet both of you, and I think it's awesome that you're giving space for people to share about adoption, and it's certainly a resource I would have loved to have found before now.
Well, that's the whole reason.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm gonna jump in there too, because I'm exactly what Jess said, like that this wasn't supposed to be like just people telling their stories, because we were really trying to inspire some change with this, but I think this story will inspire some change. So why don't we start there, Bethany, and just where do you want to start in sharing your story?
Sure. I would say that one of the main things that has helped me was that I had a mom who really embraced all sides of adoption and held a space for me to feel both good feelings about adoption and not so good feelings about adoption. And for me, that is something that I would love. Right now I'm in a place where I have a lot of friends that are adopting children, and I would love for them or anyone else looking to adopt or anyone who's an adoptee to recognize that it's okay to embrace all of the complexities around adoption from every angle. So just briefly, I was adopted at birth. I grew up with 2 amazing parents, and my brother is also adopted from a different birth family. And we have 2 very, very different stories and feelings around adoption. So I want to recognize also that adoption comes in every type of flavor. And I recognize that my story has many really beautiful parts that other people's stories don't have. And it also comes with its own subset of challenges that other people's might not have either. So also just want to start off by recognizing that I really see the variance in the adoption spectrum and want to recognize that before I even get into sharing any specifics around my past.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. And this story kind of hits home for me because that situation is what I'm raising right now. 2 of our kiddos, and both adopted from different birth families. So that's why I'm intrigued so much and selfishly listening and hanging on every word.
And just to complete that triangle, I'm a birth mom with 2 very different adoption stories. I have one very open and one very closed adoption story. So between all 3 of us and our personal stories, we really embody that both and aspect in adoption.
So I can kind of start by just saying that I grew up not wanting to speak about adoption. I also grew up knowing from the time I could ever remember that I was adopted. My parents did such a wonderful job weaving that into my life. My mom would read stories and say, "Oh, I bet your birth mom would be so proud of you," or, "I'm so proud of you, and I bet your birth mom is so proud of you." And I would just say, like, "Shut up. I don't want to hear about that. I can't even take that on." It felt heavy. It felt weird. I didn't want to think about anyone else being my mom except for my mom. And now in hindsight, I'm quite grateful for that foundation that she set for me and not ever pretending that it wasn't there or trying to gloss over that that wasn't part of my life.
Mm-hmm.
But then I'd, go to school and someone would say like, well, what does it feel like to be an orphan and to not have your parents love you? And I remember thinking, well, that doesn't feel right either. That's not my story. So I just kind of reserved myself to not speaking about adoption. And because I am the same race as my parents, that also allowed me to kind of skirt the questions, and I didn't really have to face them, but they manifested in other ways of feeling fragmented, of feeling sort of dissociated from maybe what I felt or didn't feel. I've talked to a lot of people that are adopted, and I think across the board, there's always a sense of a missing piece.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a theme for me that has carried on a long time. And that sense of there's something else about me that's missing was always something I was reconciling with.
Yeah.
And I don't want to keep on talking without.
Well, no, I mean, what you're saying is resonating. I'm for sure going to cry on this one, but I think that it's a couple of things that I was like, I'm curious that, that age where you're like, stop it, mom, I don't want to hear about her. I'm curious how early, what age you remember feeling those feelings. And then the other question I have is, well, not even question. I'm curious in terms of, like your experience going to school and saying like, well, how does it feel to be an orphan? How often you heard or overheard directly or indirectly, because we were at a party the other night. I will come full circle, I promise.
Yeah.
We were at a party the other night and we were with friends, and they are very loving, compassionate, educated people. And we were talking about kids drinking in high school and the experiences that we all had growing up with as kids that either chose to drink or didn't drink in high school. And one of them said, I would never would. My parents told me they would give me up for adoption if they ever caught me drinking. And I was like, I didn't even know what to say, but I was like, the room caught it. I don't know if I'm sure it's coming in the next day or two that I will get a phone call from her. But I was just like immediately on fire, and I'm a 46-year-old woman, and I didn't know how to handle that. And so I'm curious how often as a child did you or did you not hear those things? Because that's one of my greatest fears raising two kiddos, is that I know what I can control when they're around me, but I can't control, what they hear and see and feel in the wide, wide world. And I'm curious about your experience with that.
Gosh, yes. I think they hear everything. I think that goes regardless of adopted or not, but adoption, I think, is a kind of a little bit of a wound that you walk around with that like anyone can poke if they know without even knowing it, where other things like we just don't know it that way. But I mean, I remember being in high school and there was that movie Dodgeball, and they say something like you're adopted, your parents don't even love you. And all my friends would laugh, and I would know that it was coming and I'd go leave the room so that I didn't have to hear it. And on the flip side, then there were times where I would find my voice and say, not in those moments, but when someone said like, you're an orphan, and I'd say, no, I could kind of stand up for myself a little bit. But I would say probably at age 7 was the time that I could remember being spoken to about my birth mom, even from my own mom, and just being like, shut up, I don't want to hear about it. And I think it's such a complex thing because I don't know if at that time I was absorbing a loss of her or not wanting my mom, like whatever it was. I just remember thinking, this doesn't feel good to me. And I don't know how to handle it other than to say, just get it, like, just stop talking about it. But if I could go back, if someone said, do you wish she hadn't talked about it? I would say absolutely not. I'm so glad that she did, because it began to lay the foundation for being able to stand upon that once I did learn more. And how I learned more was, I always knew I was adopted. I remember being in my parents' office. I was 15 and I was trying to find something for school, and I found a piece of paper and it had said, It was said, birth mother, her name, it said her age, her height, her weight, her eyes, and then next to it, it said birth father, nothing. There was nothing there. And for her, it said 15 years old. And I just remember, and then I found essentially like an application that my parents had put in for me. And I remember having two things. Like, one, you had to apply for me. Like, this seemed just ridiculous. Like, that was I just had I was so naive. I had no idea. So then that made me feel very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing was, oh, wow, that was seeing that piece of paper for me, and I can imagine maybe for someone else it would be the opposite, but for me it was almost this cathartic feeling of, oh, she's real. This isn't just some sort of story that my mom is telling me. Like, she's real, and she was 15 and I'm 15. And in that moment, I remember thinking how brave of her to carry me and essentially foster me safely for 9 months. Mm-hmm. To then make a choice that I don't know in this moment that I could have made, and how selfless and courageous. And I just remember having a whole mix of emotions of just like, wow, there she is. Like, she's real. And I don't think I could have done what she did. Mm-hmm. And I remember feeling zero, oh my gosh, how could she have done this? That just wasn't how I felt. My brother has a very different story. Other adopted, like that, but that for me, being 15, seeing that as a 15-year-old just was humbling. And then what my mom did next, to me, was probably the most pivotal moment in my adoption journey that I could ever have. It was how my mom handled what happened when I brought her that paper that changed everything about how I felt about myself and my adoption story.
Ugh, I'm sobbing. I'm like dying to know this. I think this is so poignant, and I'm let's not interrupt. Let's keep going.
Well, so my mom, and I even tried to write it down because sometimes I wonder if I can speak to it myself without, tearing up. But my mom's reaction was that when I brought her this piece of paper, and I remember just saying, like, what is this? And I remember her saying, honey, that was supposed to be like, this was a closed adoption. That was supposed to be for the court. I stole it. I figured you might want to know it. So I stole it. And so I remember being like, that's pretty badass that she stole it. That's pretty cool. And also she said, I figured I already saw everything on it. I remembered it anyway. Who cares if I took it? And so then she said, I don't know much, but I will tell you everything I know, and I will do whatever you feel you want to do. You want to find her? We'll go find her. You want to hold the paper? Hold the paper. You want to go somewhere? Let's go somewhere. She just completely almost like walked beside me, and basically, instead of saying, why are you curious? Why now? What about this? She essentially was like, hey, let's be curious together. Mm-hmm. Let me walk with you while we figure out what this is about. Let me be there with you while we navigate this. Like, what do you want to do? I'm ready. And oddly enough, I said, I'm not ready. I'm 15. If I went through this, I don't even know if I'd want to see. Like, I don't know what I've done to her life. I don't know what she thinks of me. I don't know how she's going to remember this. Like, I don't have the maturity to be rejected right now. Like, if I went and found her and she said, you ruined my life, I don't want anything to do with you, I didn't have the capacity at the time to handle that. Mm-hmm. And so I told my mom that, and she said, no problem. Do you want more? Like, what else do you know? And because she kept saying, like, you sure? Like, I'll look through to see what else I have. I remember just saying, like, you know what? No. Had she said to me, that's nothing. What are you looking at that for? I don't understand, like, why you need to feel this way, or what's going on here. I probably would have not felt seen in all capacities, and I probably would have pushed myself to a limit that I wasn't capable of being at.
And I think we all can identify that, well, first of all, I would love to hug your mom too, because
Same.
that is the right way to handle things. And it takes a lot of courage on her part too, because you're her baby too. And
Yeah.
the idea of like, she doesn't want you to get hurt either. But so that like, that's the right way to handle it. But obviously, like anybody that would handle it the way you're talking about in terms of like, why are you curious? And those are all just insecurities that live within those adoptive parents that probably haven't gotten the education that they need to know, to fully come to terms with, this isn't like, people always ask me like, are you jealous of her? In terms of the talking, her being our kids' birth moms. And my answer is like, absolutely not. I am like in awe of her, and
Mhm.
I think anybody that's gone through this in a healthy way realizes like, I want our kids to be able to have a relationship with them, because that's the way that our kids are going to be the happiest and healthiest, is if they can get their questions answered when they're ready, in the right format, at the right cadence, like all that kinds of, but it's hard. That's a really hard balance. So kudos to your mom. And it's a lovely way to present that story, and that you're presenting it with like, there is trauma and beauty in it, which really is adoption.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, a few years later, I was home for a college break, and my mom had said, hey, do you want to go? This was out of the blue. She had said, and she had actually just gotten diagnosed with breast cancer. I didn't know that at the time, but I don't know if that had any, I don't know if that played a role in this curiosity that she had as well or not. And she is since in remission. But she said, you know what, I want to take the day off and let's drive to Brattleboro and let's look for pictures of your birth mom. And I remember being like, oh, that sounds kind of fun. That sounded pretty hands off and just like a fun thing to do. And again, I just have to highlight being an active participant in my curiosity, but still in my cadence, like you mentioned, was really incredible. And when she came home that day from work for us to go, she was holding a piece of paper and she said, you're never going to believe this, but I Googled your birth name, and my birth name was on that original paper that I had found. And that was a name that my birth mom had given me. And my mom, Googled that name, and she came home holding a paper and said, you're never going to believe this, but I Googled your birth name. And she shows me the paper and it says, I'm a birth mother in search of a birth family. I was 15 years old when I gave this child up for adoption, and I believe her first name is Bethany. And so a month prior, she had been looking for me, and my mom is like giddy with excitement. You're never going to believe this, And so that was so, so cool too. Just again, I recognize like the privilege that I have in this situation of that's not everyone's story by any means. And I'm so fortunate that this has happened to me the way it unfolded. Granted, there's also, again, the both and thing, a ton of additional trauma that my birth mother has been through and that her life has taken. And so this is a really wonderful thing that happened, I think, for all of us to be able to, connect. And essentially after we went, my mom, she asked me, do you want to respond to this registry? And I said, well, she said a birth family. Can you respond? And so my mom sends a message just saying, Bethany is happy and healthy. We have supported you and loved you. And we believe that what you have done is like the most courageous and bravest act of love that we could ever imagine. Again, for me, watching my mom send that email, how do you not just see that as such an example of her own selflessness and her own strength? And to me, highlighted like these two women who are the cornerstone of why I exist. And both of them with this utmost love and respect for one another just is probably the most humbling experience of my life. We ended up meeting with my birth mom in Maine, where I went to college, and for my 19th birthday. And my birth mom brought me 19 birthday cards, and my mom and dad. My dad's also an amazing person in this too, but they brought all my baby books. And so they showed like, here's everything we have. Like, look through it. We'll tell you everything. Yeah, I just don't know how to state enough that the unconditional, not just love from my mom, but the willingness to embrace every part of this entire journey has been very humbling as a kid and a hard thing to live up to as a mom too. Like I admire her so much from now having my own kids too.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit more about that first meeting?
Yeah.
Put yourself in your 19-year-old body, because I'm nervous.
So I had talked with her on the phone a couple times prior to that. And I vividly remember when she got out of the car and her son Tanner, who was 7 at the time, who was my half brother, she had said Tanner's pretty shy, but he ran over to me first and gave me this big hug, which was really sweet. And then I remember hugging her, and I'm 35 now and she was 30 at the time maybe. So I remember hugging her and looking at her thinking, oh my gosh, I've never seen someone that we look alike. I've never looked at my mom or dad and thought, oh, I look like my mom or dad. That was my first thing of like, oh my gosh, this is a very odd experience. This is very different. This has never happened before. And then I don't know how to explain it. I really just remember feeling almost an adrenaline high rush this entire time we were together, and just a space that had a ton of love in it, but also a lot of pain. It was a really beautiful day. And this is where I think it can be it was, when you talk about it, it's like this picture perfect moment. And it was beautiful. And there's also this level of like, oh my gosh, my parents worked so hard for so long to have a child. And she has worked so hard and so long to heal herself from the trauma of even, giving birth to me and having her in her life. And now here we are. And she's been worried about me this whole time, wondering, did I give this child a good life? Did I put them in a situation that now I was in that I would never have wanted a child to be in? She's had her own hardships. And so I think for me, if anything, I think it has solidified to me that this sounds corny and I don't mean it to, but I feel that it's so necessary for me to live my life with kindness and love, and to make use of these people that have sacrificed so much for me to even be on this planet. And so I think I feel very humble for the experience of the love I have gotten from every person in this story.
It's incredible. This is the most tears I've ever had on the podcast, but I'm so grateful. What is your relationship like now? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jess.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious what your relationship is. Like, how did it evolve and what is it like now?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I would say that one thing I think for everyone to remember in every capacity is that all of us are complex people. So, I think if any time we watch a happy movie and the happy movie ends, in our mind, the happiness just goes on forever. There's no tumult, there's nothing bad that happens. And I would say that my birth mother and I still have a very good relationship. We don't live anywhere near each other, and we don't communicate all the time. And for a little while, I think I felt like, well, my mom did a very good job with boundaries with me growing up. There was never I think she had there's a below the kid line and there's an above, there's the adult conversations and there's the kid conversations. And she did a very good job, I think, knowing where those were. My birth mom, I think after years and years, wanted to tell me everything about her life. And I don't know if I was ready at the time to absorb all of that. And so there was a space of time where that relationship felt uneasy to me a little bit. Mm-hmm. When she found out I was pregnant, I think she thought that I was going to give birth and think, how could she have done this? I think she thought that I was going to give birth to my child and think, how could I have ever given this child up? And there was a pivotal moment in our relationship where I had to say, I have never resented you. I have never held anything for you other than love and joy. And I promise you, when I give birth to this baby, that is not going to be a thought that comes into my head. And it wasn't. If anything, I really believe that giving birth, or like you can give birth, and that's a beautiful thing, and you've done an amazing act of love, and that's the reason why I'm here. And I continue to love my kids more and more and more and more and more every day. So I don't think that you need to give birth to your child. Like if you give birth to your child and you give them up for adoption, to me, that is that's the furthest thing from saying, how could you do that? How could, like, to me, I'm like, that's the most courageous thing to do. And I was in a place where I, was intentionally trying to get pregnant, and we really wanted to welcome this baby into the world. And still, there was not one part of me that ever thought, how could my birth mom have done this? In fact, it really just made me think, like, wow, she carried me this entire time, had a healthy pregnancy, gave birth to me, and then I've gotten to reap the benefits of two incredible parents.
Yeah, but I do think that really speaks to the to guilt and the shame that I think is carried, and especially on the birth parent side, that can not only be carried but grow over time, especially if there isn't contact, and what that can do to somebody's psyche, and just it can be a downward spiral, which is one of the reasons that all birth parents need support. To understand, and like stories like this are really, really essential in terms of trying to kind of change that path, because I mean, the awe and respect that I have, I often, my daughter is now 7, and she is the bravest kid in our family. Like we'll go in for a flu shot, or she got an expander put in the other day, and she doesn't even flinch. And the kind of the doctors are like waiting for the flinch, and she's like, put it in, let's go. and I'm the other day I was like, where do you get your brave, girl? Like, where do you get this brave? And then it clicked. I was like, I know exactly where she gets her brave. And that's the kind of thing that, like, I share that with her birth mom, because I'm like, you gave her brave. Like, the brave in her is from you. It's not from me. Like, I'm a puddle. Look at me today. Jeez.
Love
that's you get your brave from her. I know exactly where you get it.
I love that, because as my mom always said, that she said it was great to have kids that were adopted, because I never tried to push my own stuff. She's an amazing piano player. She never kind of like forced us to play piano. And then she'd kind of relish in these things in a way that maybe like that I might not be able to do with my kids. If my kids are good at something and it's something I'm good at, it's harder to be like, oh my gosh, it's just a different dynamic, where as my mom could appreciate and my parents could appreciate anything that was new or different to me, as like, wow, Bethany's her own kid, where like all of my kids are my own, like their own selves. But it's weird how you almost impose some of your own things because they're your biological kids. And sometimes I think, man, this would be sometimes easier if they were adopted, because I wouldn't be thinking, I'm not doing a great job articulating that, but
what you're talking about.
I
know exactly, because people even do it for us too. Go ahead, Jeff.
Go ahead. Well, I was
no,
just
you
have
a slight delay, and I want to hear from you. Keep going.
I was just going to say that Janie, my second daughter's mom, does all the time, because they had 2 biological kids before they adopted Ella. And she says all the time that when they adopted Ella, she had to learn a completely different way of parenting, because Ella is independent and stubborn and full of fire, and her other kids are amazing and wonderful, but they're a little quieter and more reserved. And she says all the time, like, I had to learn a different parenting style to parent Ella.
Yeah, it's true. And that's the kind of stuff that I think any kind of adoptive parents that have done the work know, like, highlight that, don't hide it. Like that should be celebrated, just like you would, like in it's celebrated constantly in society in terms of like biological children, and like, oh, you're definitely your son, your dad's son, that kind of, like, it's constant in biological children, and there's no reason that we can't celebrate that too, especially as these open adoption relationships are becoming more the norm. And so you can see characteristics of the birth family in these kids.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not, again, like not something to be hidden. It's something to be highlighted.
I love it.
Jess, I know you had a couple more questions.
I was just going to say that I love how much your mom and both of your parents supported you on your journey. I feel like when we are talking with adopting families, they are terrified of open adoption or terrified of the day that their kiddos are going to search for their birth families. How much did your mom's support and kind of, you said this the first time that we talked, you said that your mom led with love and trusted that you would still love her. You know, love doesn't love doesn't divide. There is not a finite amount of love, you know, and I think that's one of the things that I want adopting families to get most out of this episode is that just because, you know, you have relationships with birth families or adoptees are going to search for their birth families one day, that doesn't mean that they're going to love you less. And how much did your mom's support and love on this journey kind of mean to you and help you in having that relationship with your birth mom?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that there is no way, I really believe that there's no way, no matter how well adjusted you are, that you don't think about this. I'm going to go on a little bit of a rant here, but I think adoptees are always going to be filled with a mix of emotion, like love for their, biological parents and alongside of their adoptive family. But there is going to be curiosity and there is going to be grief associated with it. And that doesn't mean that myself or anyone else is ungrateful or unhappy. I think it just means that they're processing the full reality of what it means to have this experience of being adopted. And something that I like to think about is if you think about a painting and you go to and look at a beautiful painting, there's light and there's shadow in a good painting. And if you look at the painting and you take away all the shadow and you just see the painting with light, you miss half the painting. It's not the full painting. It's not really as beautiful. It doesn't show the whole picture and you can't appreciate it the same way. I think the same is true with adoption. You have to be able to be alongside the shadow of the painting. That's part of your child. That's part of the experience. And to pretend that it's not there is actually not loving your child the full capacity that they are. So I think that my parents did a really good job recognizing that the full experience of being adopted meant embracing both sides of that part.
Yeah. Not to mention, I mean, we hear a lot of stories from adoptees. And I think one of the things that I hear that just is heartbreaking to me is that, just to use your analogy of the painting, is that a lot of adoptees feel like they should only show the light, and so they carry the shadow in
Yes.
secret. And the amount of like pressure that puts on a child growing up, like that's not, we would never expect a biological to cry, like never cry about something that makes you sad. That's the exact opposite of what you would want as a parent. Like, cry, share with me. I want to know highs and lows today. Like if you don't allow them or encourage them to share their shadow, they could be growing up in a very unhealthy way.
That I think that hits the nail on the head because my parents were great at supporting me, but I don't think that they even knew that I needed the support because I didn't come out and say like, hey, I'm struggling. I need to talk about this. Like I feel a little bit off because you're a kid. Something just feels a little off. And it's hard to be a kid in general. It's hard to be a kid no matter what. And I think that being able to somehow, and I don't know the best formula exactly for how, other than I do think it's important because I remember thinking, I'm so grateful. I just have to be grateful. I just have to be grateful. Like, I have nothing to complain about. Look at my life. I have this amazing life. Like, why, I don't even want to let my mind go there. So I think you're right. If we don't allow a space for our kids to recognize a shadow or be able to talk about that, or even bring it up for them. Like that's what my mom would do for me. That was very helpful, is she would bring it up for me. And then it was me denying like I could choose to take the shadow or leave it, but she would acknowledge it there. And that I find to be very helpful, because I think it's very, very, very easy you want someone else to recognize it. And sometimes you're just doing it in secret. And that's a very hard place to be. And I've been there too. So I very much think what you said is so true.
Yeah, I agree. I also, I mean, you were talking about your brother having a different birth story, and we have two very different stories as well, but and two very different relationships in terms of like both open, but very different in terms of the types of contact and stuff. And so I think I'm hypersensitive because we have one very open relationship and we have one that is open but less contact. And just sharing another story about that is the other day I could tell that my oldest was not necessarily struggling, but I could tell in his face that he wasn't feeling the way he normally feels. And so we talked about it, and he voiced that he was feeling something and he couldn't articulate it, because his relationship isn't as close as
Mm-hmm.
his sisters with their birth family. And so we talked about loud love and quiet love. It was, I don't even know where I got them, sure, it was in some kind of family book, but it was, like some love is really loud and some love is really quiet, but it's not a less than love, and that kind of thing. Because I think that was really helpful to us. That's been one of the things that we have struggled with in terms of, we, because the relationships are open, people would insinuate like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
they care more or they care less than, and it's like, that's just so not at all the case. But it's, like relationships are different. And I think what you talked about in terms of your birth mom feeling kind of shame or carrying something with her that she was concerned about, like those are real feelings that would prevent someone from reaching out or having a bigger, deeper relationship. But it's not to say that it would never happen.
Yes. And I think sometimes it's recycled. Like grief and shame is often also love in a different form. At the crux of it, I think when we feel grief towards something, it's because we also feel some sort of love there too. And I think that can go both ways, whether it's a child feeling grief or a birth family feeling grief, or either way. But I think there is so much more love in all of these stories than we even recognize sometimes, because on the outside they can seem different. But I think the crux of most adoption is built upon love, even when it doesn't look like that from the outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I want to touch on one thing, Jess, before you,
Yeah.
and Jenny, one question, because Bethany said something in the beginning that I just think is really important, and I don't want people to gloss over it. But when you were talking about being in your parents' office and you found that paper and you found an application, and that it created some kind of level of discomfort inside you, or like they had an application for me. That's just, we don't have to dwell too much on it, but it's just one of the things that I think we focus so heavily on at Pear Tree is the way you adopt matters, because your children are going to eventually find out the process by which you adopted, the professionals you used. Eventually, the birth mom will be able to share her side of the story in terms of the process. And I think because more and more families are being diagnosed with infertility and more people are turning to adoption, there is this like, well, let me just adopt and then I'll figure out how to message it later. And that's just like, I just want to reiterate, because I'm like, here's another example. The process you use matters, and
Mm-hmm.
you want to be able to look your child in the face and tell them honestly the process without any kind of pangs of like guilt or baggage, or that you skirted something or you shortcut something
Mm-hmm.
or you paid something to jump a line or anything like that. Like you just
Or
want to make sure
not,
your process is on the up and up, because it will come up.
and you don't want to feel any sense of guilt or shame when your kiddo eventually finds that application and that paperwork when they're looking for something completely different in your office one day.
Yeah. Okay, I know.
I was just going to say the last question that we were going to ask was, before we get to the very last question, but the last question we were going to ask was, what advice would you give, adopting families that might be afraid of open adoption, or what would you want them to know? I feel like this entire episode has been advice for adopting families that might be scared of openness or need some guidance navigating open adoption, or helping support their kids in search and reunion. But is there anything one last thing that you want adopting families to know, or one piece of advice you want to give them?
So if I can, I'd like to give a piece of advice to adopting families, and then one piece of advice to adoptees that for me would have been just like, I would have loved another adoptee to like tell me this as a kid. So the first two families would be, don't be afraid to be curious alongside your child. Don't be afraid to like sit with them in their curiosity, be an active participant in their curiosity, while also continuing to be their parent and knowing that you likely have a good pulse of what's coming from a place of fear and what's coming from a place of love. And if it's coming from a place of love, then be curious with your kid, and then recognize if you're feeling frantic and you're feeling jealousy, or if you're feeling things that are not coming from a place of love, then you probably need to kind of step back and rethink it, because it's probably not real. Like that's probably a hallucination of your mind saying, oh no, there's not enough for me, so they're not going to love me. I think if you're going into it with a scarcity mindset, you've got to regroup yourself before you go back into the situation with your kid, because that's probably not the best version of yourself, and it's probably not the truth, because love is not finite. So that would be what I would say to parents. But what I would say to an adoptee is that if I could ever have given a message to myself before any of this happened, I would have said to my little self, Bethany, you are already whole. You are already a complete person. You already have everything you need inside of you. And I know that it's very common for people who are adopted to feel fragmented, or like pieces of them are missing. And those feelings are real and they're valid. But I truly believe deep down, you are a complete person. And somewhere within yourself, you know this. You already know that you have everything that you need to be whole.
That is beautiful.
I love that. I don't even know if I want to ask the last question. I think that was just such a way to wrap up this episode.
That would be, that would be my final say.
I'm good. Let's wrap at that. I don't want to say anything else. I want to leave that with everybody.
Same. Bethany, thank you so much for...
Thank you guys.
For joining us and for being so open and honest and sharing your story. I think if we were going to imagine like the perfect episode to share during National Adoption Awareness Month, I don't think we could have dreamed up a better conversation to have.
Well, thank you.
Same.
I really appreciate it. It felt very nice to be open, coming from a kid who would have crawled under a bed rather than even said out loud that I was adopted. This is quite liberating. So
good.
Well,
okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of Modern Adoption, and subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss an episode.
And we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode full of education, insight, and important conversations.